Communion was never a memorial. It's an enforcement. E.W. Kenyon. If you have ever taken the bread and the cup and felt nothing but a quiet sadness, like visiting a grave, you were taught to grieve at a table that was built for you to give orders. Here is where we begin. In 1 Corinthians 11:26, the word says, "For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, ye do shew the Lord's death till he come." That word shew is not a whisper of remembrance. It is a legal proclamation, a courtroom word. And Kenyon would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The table was never given so you could look backward in sorrow. It was given so you could stand forward in your rights." The early church did not eat that bread the way you eat a memory. They ate it the way a man eats before he goes to fight, knowing the victory is already signed. The tragedy is that generations were handed a tombstone when they were handed a title deed. Say it with me. I eat as an heir of the covenant. I drink as one enforcing my rights. I rise from this table already healed and already free. This is my legal ground. Again, I eat as an heir of the covenant. I drink as one enforcing my rights. I rise from this table already healed and already free. This is my legal ground. If this is starting to move something in you, subscribe now, so tomorrow's teaching finds you the moment it is ready. Before we go further, type the words "I'm ready" in the comments, not because a phrase changes anything by itself, but because something in you just settled into place hearing this. And naming it out loud is how you seal it. The first law is this: the table is not a monument, it is a document. Kenyon taught that the Lord's Supper stands as the new covenant reduced to a visible, edible form. The same way a deed of trust represents a house you cannot carry in your pocket. When you sign a deed, you do not sit and stare at the paper weeping over what it cost the seller. You take the paper to the courthouse and you enforce your ownership. The early believers understood the bread as his body given and the cup as his blood shed. Two exhibits of a finished transaction, not two symbols of a sad story. Think of a soldier holding his discharge papers. He does not read them and cry about the war. He reads them and walks into his new life as a free man. That is what the table was built for. So when you kneel at communion and only feel sorrow, you are holding a discharge paper like a funeral notice, and no wonder nothing changes afterward. Picture a woman named Ruth who has taken communion every first Sunday for 30 years. Every time the plate comes to her, she bows her head and pictures a hill and a cross, and she cries a little, and she feels holy for an hour, and then she goes home to the same aching knees and the same tight budget, and the same fear she has carried since she was a girl. Nobody ever told her the meal was a filing cabinet and not a photograph. Nobody ever told her she was holding a verdict already signed in her favor and mistaking it for a eulogy. This is the tragedy Kenyon kept pointing at. Not that people were insincere, but that they were sincerely aiming the table at the wrong target. Sorrow was never the assignment. Enforcement was. A deed does not care how tenderly you feel about it. A deed only works when you carry it into the room where ownership is decided. The meal was never a memorial dinner for a dead man. It is a signed release for a living heir. And once you see the table as a document instead of a monument, you are ready to ask a harder question. What exactly does this document entitle you to enforce? The second law is this: the bread is a legal exhibit for your body, not a symbol for your feelings. Kenyon pointed to the plain wording. This is my body which is broken for you. And he taught that sickness and weakness were part of the curse, his body absorbed in your place. So eating that bread was meant to be a declaration over your body, a courtroom moment where you present the exhibit and say, "This covers me." Imagine a man who has an insurance policy paid in full, sitting in his hospital bed, refusing to file the claim because he is too busy admiring the paperwork. That is what it looks like to take communion as sentiment only. The bread is not there to make you feel tender about a crucifixion 2,000 years gone. It is there, so you place your hand on your own chest, the way a lawyer places a hand on a filed brief and say, "This was purchased for me." Think for a moment about a woman named Ruth. She takes communion every Sunday of her life. She bows her head. She chews the small piece slowly. She feels the familiar ache of gratitude. And every Monday morning, her body still carries the same tired joints, the same restless nights, the same quiet dread she brought in with her. Nothing in her circumstances ever moves, and she assumes this is simply how faith feels, patient, sorrowful, waiting. But Kenyon would say she was never actually using the exhibit. She was admiring it. She held the paid claim in her hand every single week and never once presented it. She treated the bread like a photograph of a loved one instead of a check she was entitled to cash. Now picture another believer holding that same small piece of bread, and instead of only feeling something, she says inside herself, "This body was broken so mine does not have to carry this pain. This exhibit stands for my healing right now." She is not reciting a nice thought. She is filing a legal document in the one courtroom that matters, the courtroom of her own heart, where confession takes hold of what Calvary already settled. When you eat it as Kenyon taught, as identification with a finished work rather than a memory of a finished man, you are filing the claim in the room where it counts, not admiring the paperwork, but presenting it, and once the bread has spoken plainly for your body, the cup still has business to finish for something deeper. The third law is this: the cup is not a toast to sorrow, it is a seal on a covenant. In the ancient world, a blood covenant was the strongest bond two parties could make, stronger than any modern contract, stronger than any handshake. When blood was shed and shared between two parties, it meant the terms were now unbreakable, backed by life itself, backed by something no lawyer's ink could ever match. Kenyon taught that the cup represents the blood that ratified the new covenant, the same way a wax seal once made a king's decree unchangeable the moment it was pressed into the paper. So when you drink that cup, you are not toasting a memory, you are pressing your own seal onto an agreement that guarantees you righteousness, healing, provision, and standing before God with no accusation, able to stick. Think of two business partners closing a deal. They sign the papers, and then they share a cup together at the table. Nobody at that dinner is weeping. Nobody is staring into the glass, mourning what the deal cost them. They are celebrating terms that are now locked in stone, unbreakable, unchangeable, guaranteed. That is the spirit the early church carried to the table, not mourning, but confidence, the quiet certainty of people who know the ink is dry and the deal is done. Now picture it closer to home. Picture a father who spent years building a small business, and on the night he finally signs it over to his son, they do not sit in silence grieving the years of labor behind them. They raise a glass together, because the transfer is complete, because the terms are sealed, because from that night forward, the son runs the business as an owner and not as a hired hand hoping for scraps. That is the picture Kenyon wanted you to carry to the table every time you lift that cup. Not a graveside gathering, but a signing ceremony. And here is where it gets practical, because a sealed covenant does nothing for a man who never reads what it grants him. You can hold the most powerful document in the world in your own hands and still live like a beggar if you never learn its clauses. You can carry a deed to a house you never move into. You can hold stock in a company whose dividends you never cash. So the question becomes, what did Kenyon say you were actually enforcing when you drank that cup? And the answer is bigger than most churches ever taught. It touches your body. It touches your mind. It touches your finances. It touches your very right to stand unafraid in a room that once made you tremble. And once you feel the weight of that, you cannot go back to sipping grape juice out of habit, the way you might sip coffee on a dull morning. You start reaching for the cup the way a man reaches for a weapon he finally remembered he owns, the way a soldier reaches for a rifle he had forgotten was loaded. The cup stops being a small ceremonial pause in a service, and it becomes the moment you press your own seal on everything the covenant already promised you. The fourth law is this: the difference between ritual and enforcement is entirely in how you spend the hour. Picture two believers on the same Sunday morning. Both wake early, both dress carefully, both walk into the same building and sit in the same kind of pew, and by 11 o'clock both are handed the same small piece of bread and the same small cup. The first one closes her eyes, remembers a Sunday school picture of a cross, feels a soft, familiar sadness, swallows, wipes a tear, and walks back to her seat unchanged. By Tuesday, her body still aches the same. Her bank account still worries her the same. Her marriage still carries the same silence at the dinner table. Nothing shifted because nothing was ever enforced. The second one closes her eyes and instead pictures a courtroom. She eats the bread and says quietly in her heart, "This body was broken, so mine would not carry this weakness." She drinks the cup and says, "This blood sealed my peace, my provision, my healing, and I am taking hold of it now." By Tuesday, something in her has changed, not because the elements were different, but because one woman used the table the way Kenyon taught, as a point of contact where confession takes hold of what was legally settled at Calvary. Notice the hour itself never changed. The bread weighed the same, the cup poured the same, the organ played the same final hymn. The only difference in that entire 60 minutes was what each woman chose to do with her voice and her attention while the elements sat in her hand. That is the whole hinge the fourth law turns on. The same bread, the same cup, the same room, the same minute on the clock. And yet two entirely different transactions walked out the door. One a quiet funeral dressed up in Sunday clothes. The other a courtroom victory carried home in an ordinary purse. This is why the phrase communion was never a memorial matters so much here, because a memorial asks nothing of you but a tear, while an enforcement asks everything of you: your voice, your attention, your willingness to actually claim the paper sitting in your own two hands instead of merely admiring it. So this week, before you take communion again, pause for a moment and pick one real thing in your life that needs enforcing: your health, your peace, your finances, your children. Name it silently before you eat. Let the clock keep ticking the same way it always does, but let this 1 hour finally belong to you instead of to sorrow. The fifth law is this, and it is the deepest one, so let it unfold in pieces. First, consider that Kenyon built his entire ministry on one distinction most churches never taught: the difference between legal rights and vital rights. A legal right is what the covenant grants you on paper: healing, righteousness, victory, provision, freedom from condemnation. It became legally yours the moment Jesus said it is finished. But a vital right is what you actually possess in daily experience, and Kenyon taught plainly that many believers have every legal right sitting untouched because they never learned to turn the legal into the vital. This is the entire secret of the table. Communion is the appointed place where a legal right becomes a vital right, through confession, through identification, through the believer standing up inside their own heart and declaring what already belongs to them until it becomes real in their body and their circumstances. Second, consider the courtroom picture fully. In a courtroom, nothing happens by wishing. A judgment sits idle on paper until someone with standing walks in and enforces it. A landlord can win an eviction case and still watch a tenant squat in his house for months if he never files the enforcement order. The ruling was real, the win was real, but reality on the ground required a second action, a deliberate legal step taken by someone who knew they had the right to take it. This is exactly the picture Kenyon painted of the believer at the table. Jesus already won the case at Calvary. The verdict is filed. Sickness has no legal claim. Poverty has no legal claim. Fear has no legal claim. But the tenant is still sitting in the house until you, the one with standing, walk into that inner courtroom and file the order yourself. Third, consider why so many believers never do this. It is because they were handed the wrong instructions. They were told the table is a place to feel sorry, a place to examine their unworthiness, a place to weep quietly and shuffle back to the pew. And Kenyon would say that is precisely backwards. Sorrow has no legal power. Shame has no legal power. Only the spoken confession of what the Word already grants carries weight in that inner courtroom, so a believer can sit at 10,000 communion services feeling appropriately sad and never once enforce a single right, while another believer, understanding what Kenyon taught, sits at one table and walks away with a healing already moving, because they finally filed the claim that was theirs the whole time. Fourth, consider what this means for the ordinary rhythm of your week. Communion was never meant to be a rare, heavy, occasional ritual reserved for a sad hush inside a sanctuary. In the earliest church, believers broke bread often, sometimes daily, in their homes, around ordinary tables, because they understood it as a repeated legal act, not a yearly funeral. Imagine a business owner who has a signed contract guaranteeing payment, but instead of ever filing for the money, he keeps the paper in a drawer and only takes it out once a year to admire it sadly. That is what a rare, sorrowful communion becomes, but a believer who takes the bread and cup regularly, deliberately, as an act of enforcing what is legally theirs, is like the business owner who files the claim the moment it is due, again and again, until payment becomes a steady, expected rhythm instead of a distant hope. Fifth, and this is the turn Kenyon kept returning to in his teaching, the enforcement is not magic, and it is not empty ritual either. It lives entirely in the marriage of the physical act and the spoken confession. The bread without the declaration is just food. The cup without the declaration is just drink. But the bread taken while you say in your heart, "This covers my body," and the cup taken while you say "This seals my covenant," becomes the very point where heaven's legal verdict steps into your physical day. This is why Kenyon insisted that words are containers, that what you confess over the elements is what carries the power out of the courtroom and into your kitchen, your workplace, your body, your bank account, and once you understand this fifth law fully, you cannot unsee it. Every communion becomes a courtroom, every believer becomes their own advocate, and the whole tone of the table shifts from a funeral hush to the steady, quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly what they are owed and is finally collecting it. The sixth law is this: you do not need a grand setting to enforce a covenant. You only need the willingness to do it plainly and often. Kenyon watched believers turn communion into something so formal and rare that it lost its daily power. Dressed up once a month in a hushed sanctuary, treated like a museum piece behind glass, when the earliest table was nothing like that at all. It was bread from the kitchen, wine from the cellar, ordinary people gathered in small rooms enforcing what was theirs, without ceremony or performance. Picture a woman named Alice. She works 2 jobs, she raises 3 children alone, and every Tuesday night, after the dishes are cleared, she sets aside a small piece of bread and a small cup of juice at her own kitchen table. No candles, no hushed music, just a tired woman and a chipped plate, and she says quietly, This body was broken, so my body carries no more of this exhaustion. This covenant covers my rent, my children, my peace. And she eats, and she drinks, and she goes to bed. Nothing about that kitchen looks powerful. No one watching would call it holy. And yet Kenyon would say, that table carries the exact same legal weight as any grand cathedral altar, because a signed deed is a signed deed, whether it is filed downtown in marble halls or scribbled at a kitchen counter under a flickering bulb. The courtroom does not care about the furniture. It only cares whether the claim was filed. This is the quiet miracle so many miss. The ordinariness of the table was never a weakness. It was always proof that the power lives in the covenant itself and not in the room around it. So this week, do not wait for a special service to remember what Kenyon saw so clearly. Take a small piece of bread over your own table. Take a small cup and speak plainly over what you need, your body, your family, your work, your peace, and let it become as normal as breathing, because a right you only exercise once a year stays weak from disuse, while a right you exercise often grows sure and steady in your hands. Communion was never a memorial, it was always an enforcement, and it is just as available to you tonight at your own worn table as it ever was in any temple. I enforce my covenant right here at this ordinary table. Here is the whole picture. The table is not a monument, it is a document. The bread is not sentiment, it is a legal exhibit for your body. The cup is not sorrow, it is a sealed covenant, guaranteeing what is yours. The difference between ritual and power is nothing but whether you enforce or merely remember. The deepest secret is that every believer holds legal rights already won, waiting only to become vital through confession at that table. And none of this requires a grand setting, only a willing heart at an ordinary table. 6 turns, 1 single key. The table was never for looking back. It was always for standing up. Say it with me one last time. I eat as an heir of the covenant. I drink as one enforcing my rights. I rise from this table already healed and already free. This is my legal ground. And so the next time you sit at that table, remember what Kenyon saw so clearly. Communion was never a memorial. It was always, and it still is, an enforcement.